Chapter 3.9 Late Modern and Early Contemporary Art in the 20th Century. Our introduction tells us that the world had radically changed following two world wars. There was a global expansion in commerce, politics, cultural traditions, communications, and travel, and that the art world experienced two periods that we sort of consider to be part of this time. The modern period of art, which lasted from 1860 to 1960, and then the contemporary period from 1960 to present. There was a revolution of color and form that was pioneered by two men in particular, Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso. There was a friendly rivalry between the two, but each contributed to the expansion of certain artistic possibilities. With Matisse, it was color and form, and with Picasso, it was form and shape. Henri Matisse was a French artist. He founded a movement called Fauvism, which is French for wild beasts, and it was a very influential and unique style that was characterized by expressive forms, very decorative in nature, and had a bold use of color. This is a beautiful work by Matisse called Joy of Life, oil on canvas from 1905. And when you look at Matisse's paintings, notice the almost musical lyricism that you see, like with the dancers, the way they sort of form this circle and their bodies. You know, there's this beautiful use of almost a simplicity of line, but definitely very characteristic of Matisse. Notice how it sort of just flows from part to part, and how the bodies of these individuals, especially when they're in connection to one another, really do create this dance-like feel about them. Also note how Matisse's color palette is incredibly rich, it feels like a cry back to sort of, late Renaissance, sort of expressions of color. Again, like the Mannerist in many ways. Our book tells us that Matisse was not at all interested in trying to copy nature. He emphasized colors, making them vibrant and intense, and he really used colors as a way to express emotion. This is another work by Matisse called The Red Studio from 1911, oil on canvas. In The Red Studio, Matisse accurately shows a number of artworks in his own personal studio. The space is filled with this intense red, which sort of serves to flatten the entire picture plane, and he uses color to convey his experience of a place. Think back to, for example, the rooms of Van Gogh. And how with Van Gogh's color scheme is used to sort of create this sense of separation and anxiety. Matisse, even though he's using this sort of hot color, it again has a much more sort of inclusive vibe, right? It really sort of invites the viewer to spend time in the studio. It's not such a scary place as Van Gogh's rooms. This is an actual photograph from 1953 of Matisse in his studio, and a lot of his work, he did a lot of these paper cutouts to create these collages that he's sort of famous for. And here we actually see Matisse sitting in a wheelchair working on a new work where you can see all the bits and pieces of paper laying around him as he cuts out these figures. Our text tells us that Matisse often started with complex sketches, then later simplified the images. He used paper cutouts then to help plan them. But after being confined to that wheelchair, he began to present his cutouts as completed works unto themselves. Moving away from Matisse, we start to talk about Cubism. And basically two men, Pablo Picasso and George Braque worked together to develop this movement known as Cubism. Now, Cubism concentrated on geometric forms and the construction of pictorial space. It depicted objects and figures from more than one side at the same time. This is one of Picasso's most famous works, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and it is from 1907, oil on canvas, 8 feet by 7 feet. And I would like to, I've actually seen this piece in person and images. Picasso is one of those artists that reproductions in books and magazines, and in this case, digital reproductions, don't do him justice. I mean, if you see a Picasso in reality, it will blow your mind. They are so electric and vibrant in the way he puts these fractured planes together, which is very much a characteristic of Cubism, is amazing. I mean, it's like this moving puzzle that kind of floats before your eyes. They're really magnificent artworks. And again, if you ever get a chance to see any of his work in person, please run to go see them. In Demoiselles d'Avignon, simplified forms are changed into abstract planes. Blue and white background clashes with these warm figures in the foreground, so he creates that push-pull, whereas the warm figures come toward us and the blue background recedes back into the back, even further into the back. And he really sort of, shows influences in his work from classical poses like from Greece and Rome to, African masks, which very much influenced a lot of Picasso's work. Now, this is a work by Georges Braque called Houses at l'Estaque from 1908. And, Braque, again, a good friend of Picasso, they worked together to create this sort of new vision of the world known as Cubism. And you can see how these houses, he's really sort of just breaking them down into their most simplified states. The idea is to try to create, and notice how he sort of relates the shapes of the houses to the shapes, of the rocks and mountains around the houses, that they all become one thing, this kind of unified composition. It is a very early Cubist painting, and in this sort of changing it into this Cubist world, the houses become these stacked golden cubes and pyramids. And basically, he does what Cubism typically does. It eliminates the detail and focuses on the underlying shapes and the pattern created by those shapes. This is another Cubist work by one of Braque and Picasso's contemporaries named Juan Gris, called Bottle of Banyuls from 1914. It is a collage made up of pasted papers, oil, charcoal, and gouache, pencil on canvas. And you can see again that cutting things out, putting them together, breaking things down into their geometric patterns, very much a beautiful, specific example of the use of Cubism, in this case in collage. Many historians consider Gris to be the second phase of Cubism, using this sort of collage work. It was, even though collage is very familiar with us today, I mean, basically any photoshopped image is a form of collage. In the early 20th century, it was considered a very new technique. Gris uses a real bottle label actually in the piece, so everything else is sort of cut out of paper and painted and drawn, but he actually used the real bottle label to then bring everyday materials into the picture itself. Now, another movement, and we've talked about this a lot in this class. I mean, I've shown you guys a lot of images from this period. It's one of my favorite periods of art, is Dadaism, Dada. Basically, Dadaism was anti-art. It was founded in 1916 in Zurich, And it was a reaction against rational thought, which had led to the devastation of World War One. So, you know, the idea is that, well, if rational thinking led us into a world war where so many people died and most of Europe was blown off the map, then obviously we need to make an art that fights back against, right, those ideas, right? That was not a world that these artists, these young artists, wanted to live in. The name Dada was chosen at random from a dictionary. It focused on individuality, irrationality, chance, and imagination. This is a very rare image of a performance piece called Karawane from 1916, which was a Dada performance work. The piece by the artist Hugo Ball was performed at the Cabaret Voltaire, which was a bohemian avant-garde nightclub for artists and writers. Think of it as like the Moulin Rouge for artists and writers. It is famous for its lively and theatrical performances. And at this particular night, Ball, dressed in this weird kind of bottle-like costume, and recited an experimental sound poem that he had created. This is a work by one of the most famous of the Dada artists. This is Bicycle Wheel by Marcel Duchamp from 1951. It is a metal wheel mounted on painted wood stool. Marcel Duchamp was probably one of the most influential artists of that period. And I would suggest to you that most contemporary art made today can draw a direct line of heritage to the vision of Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp was responsible for three major art innovations: ready-mades, kinetic sculpture, and conceptual art. His piece Bicycle Wheel is an assemblage of found objects, otherwise known as a ready-made. If you make a piece and it's just made by different things that you get from different places, that's called a ready-made. This is an amazing work that is created by an artist named John Hertfield called Have No Fear, He's a Vegetarian. That was published in Regards magazine number 121 in 1936. Now, think about that. 1936, this is a predecessor to knowing all the horrors that were actually taking place in Nazi Germany. And so this is an example how artists are oftentimes, at the head of the battlegrounds in these situations, trying to sort of reveal some of the horrific truths that happen in society and maybe make people pay attention to them in a greater fashion. Picasso with his Guernica, and then works by artists such as John Hertfield. In a time where there was no internet, there was no way to sort of get information out to masses in a very expedient fashion. Artwork such as these did a lot visually, very quickly, to mobilize, the common feelings about what was going on in Europe at that time. He was a member of the Berlin Dada movement. And this piece in particular is a photo montage. He had taken different images from magazines and sort of put them back together to make the art. Most of his works criticized Adolf Hitler, and in fact, he had to flee Germany before he was murdered. His work really foreshadows many of the disasters of World War II. Now, another movement that was incredibly influential, and you can even see how in today's world, how surrealism very much had so much to do with has so much to do with what even is being produced today. Surreal means strange and dreamlike. It began in the early 1920s in Paris, and it was based on ideas by the Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and really dealt with the unconscious mind and looking at how dreams, how people sort of interpret the world through their dreamscape. Surrealists aim to challenge that idea of objective reality. This is a work by Giorgio de Chirico called The Melancholy and Mystery of the Street from 1914. And we can definitely see how de Chirico is or thinking about the mystery of a dreamscape. Notice how he has skewed perspective, so this is definitely not a world, the real world. This is a world of, of a dream where the laws of physics don't apply. And then you see the mystery, for example, of the shadow of a figure that we don't see, behind this building, this young girl who feels like she's under threat, the innocence of childhood being threatened by this sort of mysterious figure. These kind of elements definitely sort of lend themselves to this idea of surrealism. This is a great work by Max Ernst uh, called Surrealism in Painting. And so, you have really sort of a poke in the eye of a lot of the non-representational painters that were also working at the time, and then you have this strange, this creature, from Ernst's mind, painting one of these paintings, and again, another image that could almost be pulled directly from the subconscious. Surrealists also worked in a lot of sculptural works. This is by Jean Moreau called Object. It is an assemblage made up, as you can tell, by a stuffed parrot on a wood perch, with a shoe and a hat. I mean, a lot of these different kind of elements put together to create an object which, each of its individual parts might not have specific meaning, but once assembled together in this way, begin to represent something deeper about the conscious or the unconscious mind. I mean, I think you can tell already that there are so many different movements that were happening in a very short period of time. And another one is called Futurism, which took place primarily in Italy from 1909 to the late 20s. It was very much influenced by Cubism. Clashing planes and geometry were used largely in the works. But its departures from Cubism were that it celebrated dynamic movement, progress, and technology. It was very much interested in this sort of new industrial revolution that was taking place. It also was very much kind of connected to fascism, and unlike many other art forms which looked for inspiration from the past, it expressed contempt for the past. This is one of the more famous futurists' work. This is called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space by Umberto Bocciani from 1913. It's a cast bronze work. Bocciani originally made the work in plaster. It actually wasn't cast in bronze until after he died. It has a shiny golden appearance, which again sort of makes reference to the industrial age in which it was made. The figure forcefully strides through space and leaves behind the artistic traditions of the past. Here's another Marcel Duchamp, and again you can kind of see what an eclectic artist Duchamp was. This is Nude Descending a Staircase. Again, another example of a futurist work in that we're seeing, this is an abstract because we can see the figure. It is also, again, like the other futurists, thinking about motion and movement. This was a time where suddenly, the automobile was becoming more and more commonly used, and factories were sort of churning out uh, various objects to a high degree. And so artists were influenced by that. Artists are always a reflection of the world in which they live. And so, therefore, the work itself dealt with those ideas of motion, movement. Another sculptor that is sort of renowned as a futurist is Constantine Brancusi. This is his great Bird in Space from 1928, bronze, 54 by 8 by 6.5. In this work, Brancusi sought the simplest way to express the essence of his subject. He reminds us of a bird's body, a feather, or the soaring quality of flight. He considered the sculpture's base to be part of the work itself, to suggest the heaviness and earth. When I talk, usually in lecture, about Bird in Space, I the way I try to express, well, how does he get a bird out of this kind of weird lozenge space being stretched through the air? Well, I mean, think about how we often see birds, or fish is another good example. Usually, if we see them in flight, a bird, they are just a blur. It is this sort of elongated, blurred object that we just see kind of out of the corner of our eye. The same with fish in the water. Usually when we see fish, they are moving very quickly. You're not seeing details, you're just seeing this shape moving through space or water. And so, therefore, that's what Brancusi was doing. He was capturing the essence of the subject, which really is movement. I mean, a bird, what is a bird? It's flight. What is a fish? It's swimming at a rapid pace, capturing that which makes a bird or a fish or really a bird or a fish, right? That's where it's the most beautiful, when it's doing what it's designed to do. This is also the time where, from roughly 1913 and definitely post World War II, the center of the art world moved from a war devastated Europe to a largely untouched America, in particular New York. And one of the first major art shows in the United States that really sort of made the whole world kind of look toward this country is the Armory Show in New York City in 1913, that exposed the American public to many European artists, and therefore influenced a whole tradition of American artists. You had Matisse, Picasso, Kandinsky, and Duchamp. When the American art scene began to take off, it was really inspired by the harsh realities of the Great Depression. With a focus on American subjects, it was highly representational. So, and then you had two offshoots. You had your regionalists, who were sort of rural artists who espoused kind of American virtues, and then you had social realists who were interested in social justice. Now, Grant Wood is a good example with his American Gothic of a regionalist. Wood was sort of famous for doing these portraits of just working people throughout the country. And but there was, the thing that made Wood stand out is, number one, sort of his, I mean, obvious, combined with his technical skill, there was a sort of a sense of humor about them. And, they're always, like, for example, in this piece, American Gothic, the sternness in the face of the woman as she's sort of looking at her husband, right, who's looking at us, kind of not even knowing probably of this disdain held for him by his wife. And, so, and then putting that pitchfork, right, between the two of them, the pitchfork, this, with the sharp points, suggests that there is maybe something a little dangerous between these two, right? That there's something going on between the two of them. So Wood, unlike some of his peers, would at least make his subjects a little more complex. It wasn't just a morality lesson or sort of espousing a certain ideologies that were quintessentially American. He was also trying to sort of poke a little bit at the inner workings of Middle America. If we're looking for a work to exemplify social realism, you can't go any further, can't do any better than Isabel Bishop in this work called Waiting, which is an oil and tempera on gesso panel from 1938. Bishop was an American social realist, part of a group called the 14th Street School. She was very much interested in creating works to show her sympathy for the underprivileged. You can see that she worked in very quick brush strokes, very busy rhythms, and she was interested in raising the consciousness of people to the experience of everyday life in a big city. In a previous lecture, we've already talked about Dorothea Lange. This is Migrant Mother. And again, it's interesting. It's good to see it in context to other works, what else was going on when this piece was made. And again, to reiterate what we said in a previous talk, Lange's work really was intended to sort of help the public, the American public, understand the trials and tribulations of life at that time in Appalachia. This is a piece by Aaron Douglas called Aspects of Negro Life from Slavery Through Reconstruction. And, Douglas again is another beautiful example of a social realist. His work really tried to teach the American public about the history of men and women of color in this country. And as you can see, we're actually seeing from left to right this sort of not evolution, but the progression of, or the history. I don't even call it progression because it depicts some really dark moments, which you would never call progress. But that these men and women come from a proud background in Africa. They are stolen away, brought against their will to this country, and then build this country. And then by Reconstruction, they have moved past slavery, broken their bonds, and are bringing America a richer culture than it could have ever believed, and sort of elevating the country to a new level. And, of course, this only goes to Reconstruction. I mean, it continues and continues and continues. One thing I think that's interesting is there's a great artist who we'll be talking about in the next few days, who's a contemporary artist named Kara Walker, who I like quite a lot. And she does these silhouette cutouts in her work. And I don't know this to be a fact, but I have a feeling she was very much influenced by Aaron Douglas, because his work, all the figures have this sort of cut out feel about them. Abstract Expressionism. The first modern art movement to originate in the U.S. was Abstract Expressionism. It lasted from the 1940s to the 1950s. It sought to create with energy and motion this universal visual experience to which anybody could respond. Jackson Pollock, one of my favorite artists of all time. This is an image of Pollock working in his studio in Long Island. The way Pollock would work is he would place unrolled canvas on his floor, and then he would literally sort of dance around it, applying paint by pouring and dripping with sticks as well as brushes to apply the paint. He was lovingly referred to in the art world at that time as Jack the Dripper because of the way he worked the canvas. This is one of Jackson Pollock's most famous paintings, one of his more well-known paintings. This is number 1A from 1948. Notice he even, he was definitely a non-representational artist. And Pollock, even in the title of the work, calling it not even untitled, but just giving it a number, basically releases it from any sort of um, trappings of realism or even abstraction. You know, Pollock really believed that you could enjoy an artwork the same way you could enjoy a sunset or a garden or a bouquet of flowers. That you didn't need to have all this narrative. That sometimes a painting could just be a painting. That art could just sort of exist in its own way without being connected to anything in in the world of the human. And so his work, I didn't respond when I was a younger person to works such as this because I really desperately wanted there to be a narrative, right? And it wasn't until I got much older where I began to seek works like this because I think I found them to be an escape from the complexity of my day to day life. And I liked feeling I could lose myself in the sort of ordered chaos, right, of works like Number 1A. This is a Mark Rothko number 5 slash number 22. And again, like Pollock, using sort of these big swaths of color to create these fields that you just kind of, lose yourself in, that they don't have any baggage brought from outside themselves, that they exist as an entity on their own. Again, the Rothko Chapel, which is in Houston, is absolutely amazing. And I'm going to say immediately that if you get a chance, go to Houston, go to the Menil Collection, and go to the Rothko Chapel and just spend a little bit of time in there looking at these great paintings by one of the great American artists. This is a work by Helen Frankenthaler called Mountains and Sea from 1952, oil and charcoal on canvas. Uh, our text tells us that Frankenthaler, you know, in a different way to Pollock, she actually poured the paint directly on the unstretched canvas and then would move the canvas around to make the paint kind of slough around on top of the surface of the canvas. The Mountains and Sea was inspired by the landscape of Nova Scotia. And Frankenthaler really focused on formal elements in her work, line, shape, color, not interested at all in what they represented. Pop art. Now, pop art, pop's short for uh, popular, like popular culture, began in the late 1950s. It embraced recognizable subject matter and it borrowed imagery from popular culture like TV, movies, music. It combined materials of fine art, quote unquote high culture, with commercial elements. The artist most associated with the pop movement is Andy Warhol. And this is called 30 or Better Than One. And basically, what Warhol did is he took a photograph of the Mona Lisa and he created a silk screen, which we talked about in the printmaking process. And he essentially sort of repeated the image of the uh, Mona Lisa 30 times. You know, a joke that, the Mona Lisa is this priceless object. Well, even if it's priceless, if there are 30 of them, it's better than just one. Warhol was very interested in living, his family was originally from Poland, very poor. He was a first generation American, Andy was. And he loved everything about America. He loved grocery stores and the way we stock items and the way we mass produce things and the way we turn movie stars into Greek, the sort of the modern equivalent of Greek gods, right? Iconography. He came from a Catholic background, so he was really interested in, he grew up in the church and how, Mary and Jesus and the saints are sort of represented as icons in these paintings. Well, he thought, well, I can do what the Catholic Church did for Mary and Jesus. I can do that for Elvis and Marilyn Monroe and the Mona Lisa. And that's basically what he's doing. Is if a priceless object is worth so much, if I multiply that by 30, well, it's worth 30 times priceless, right? Another very famous artist from the pop movement is Roy Lichtenstein. This is called Girl in Mirror from 1964. And a lot of these works he actually painted on steel, which again is this kind of beautiful reference to the mass production of objects, right, in the 1960s. You know, this sort of the plastics and metals became such a huge, both became huge industries in 1960 America. And so here you have Lichtenstein really borrowing from comic books the way the sort of the dot pattern that was not really intentional, but it was how newspapers had to print. You know, this dot matrix was used to print, comic book imagery. And he would blow these up. I mean, this is 42 by 42 inches. So he would take like a small passage from a comic book and blow it up to a large scale. Now, anytime you have a movement, you always have another group that reacts, typically against it. And minimalism was a reaction against both abstract expressionism and pop art. Its characteristics were completely non-representational artworks, neutral textures, geometric shapes, flat colors, mechanical construction, and it totally stripped away emotion and underlying. This is a great work by Donald Judd called Untitled from 1967. If you're ever interested in seeing a lot of Judd's work, you can go about as far west as you can possibly go in Texas to Marfa, Texas. Donald Judd kind of left New York at a certain point in his career and moved to Marfa in the 70s. And basically, it was a very poor town. He bought like a lot of it, a lot of the old downtown, and turned it all into galleries and sort of personal studio space. And now you can go and kind of see a lot of his work there, especially his earthwork pieces. And so it's really a cool place to go. They do festivals every year that are amazing. So, but this is one of his more famous pieces, and again, you can see has a very mechanized feel to it, very much no emotive quality. It's really about the materials and how that kind of like it's basically these kind of metal frames, and then you have these plexiglass, panels, and so the light from above becomes filtered as it goes through these panels. So see how it gets darker by the time. It's like a value change as it goes all the way down the piece. So this is a major Judd, and he did a lot of work kind of similar to this. This is by Dan Flavin, and it's a piece. This is actually from 1996. This can actually be seen at the Menil Collection in Houston. And, Flavin works with a lot, primarily with light. These are all kind of different colored fluorescents that are sort of, connected to this power source that you see running in the center. And then these sort of fluorescents come off of it. And it creates a really interesting space. Notice how then the color is then projected up on the ceiling and on the floor, like this rainbow that you can kind of see. And the other thing that's really cool about Flavin's work is the sound, because if you're familiar with fluorescent lights, especially if you're in a room like the one shown here, that has the sound quality kind of reverberates. So there's a buzz. There's this underlying buzz as you go in, almost like tinnitus or something, right? And so you feel like you're being affected
almost at a cellular level by these sort of radioactive, you know, lightsabers kind of lined up against the wall. So is a seemingly very simple thing becomes much more complex once you're there and inside it. It really is an installation piece. Chapter 3.10, the late 20th century and art of the present day. Our text tells us that thanks to social media and communication technologies and travel, people travel to different parts of the world much more frequently than they ever have in the past. Helps to connect far off places. There's really not a center of the art world anymore. The contemporary period is anything from the year 1960 to present. Sort of ideas, experiences, and multiculturalism have now become sort of the center of the art world. Postmodernism emphasizes complexity and context, whereas postcolonialism explores social structures and diverse perspectives. So postmodernism and postcolonialism have really sort of replaced, sort of social realism, and realism is kind of like the standard by which art is kind of evaluated. Now, our book talks a lot about, you know, contemporary artists borrowing from the past and making direct references to the past. And a good example of that is this work being borrowed. This is, of course, The Fountain by Marcel Duchamp from 1950. And, we've already looked at this. We've talked about Duchamp. We've talked about Dadaism. And I even made reference when we talked about Dadaism, how it's very influential today. Now obviously Duchamp himself was very much interested in this idea of appropriation. Duchamp's ready-mades, challenged art practices by basically taking, just objects and saying that they were art. And if he said they were art, then they became artists. Well, many other artists have followed over the years in Duchamp's footsteps. This is a work by Sherry Levine, also called Fountain, but it's called Fountain after Marcel Duchamp. And, as you see here, basically Levine has borrowed something that's been borrowed. So it's this, game of almost telephone, but it becomes recontextualized in this new world. Instead of, he basically just took a real porcelain urinal and put it in a gallery and became art. Well, she took a urinal and cast it in bronze to sort of make reference to this being more than a urinal, right? It really is no longer a urinal anymore. It becomes this ode to the urinal, right? So she's taking the idea of of what Duchamp did and his work and making this sort of homage to the genius of her predecessors, and how those ideas can still be used in the creation of art today. Conceptual art. Uh, Conceptual art is basically an extension of non-representational tendencies in minimalism. Usually it completely eliminates the art object. It focuses more on the ideas than the product. And the results are often like documentaries, documentation, artist books, photographs, and performance art. This is a conceptual art piece by Joseph Kosuth called One and Three Chairs from 1965. And our text tells us that in this work, Kosuth was interested in art that appeals to the mind rather than the senses. So he presents three things that a chair can be: a photograph of a chair, an actual chair, and then the dictionary definition of a chair. And so all of these three things really do represent chairness, right? They're all the epitome of chairness. You can have a photograph of a chair, you can have an actual chair, and then you can have the definition of a chair. It really speaks very much to Duchamp's, this is, Magritte's "This Is Not a Pipe" work. So, and it investigates how we know and understand the world in which we live. With performance and body art, the artist's body itself becomes an integral part of the artwork. We already saw the piece Cut in this class with Yoko Ono, and this is another artist named Anna Mendieta called Untitled from 1973. And basically, what she did is she would put her body in various outdoor environments, sort of like allowing her body to become part of the environment, right? It reinforces the connection between the woman's body and nature, and it shows them as a source of strength, endurance, and nourishment. Earthworks. Earthworks are also called land art. They unite sculpture with nature, and they blur that boundary between art and life. They are usually location specific. Rarely are they shown in traditional art venues, and of course they're very difficult to sell. Usually artists that do earthworks are commissioned, in that someone comes to them and say, hey, I have this land, I would love to fund you to do a piece. And so they usually need a patron to help them produce these works. This is the Great Spiral Jetty, which we spoke about in a previous lecture by Robert Smithson, which is one of the most well-known earthworks. Now, this is a lesser-known work. This is by Andy Goldsworthy called Japanese Maple. And in it, you can see how he has used, these objects to sort of create this experience for people to find, basically, in the world. Goldsworthy will meticulously create these sort of intimate and then larger scale site-specific earthworks. The Ring of Leaves, he has stitched them together and then configured to contrast to the stones. He highlights the splendor of nature and then photographs them before they just sort of fall apart and return to nature. Postmodernism, identity, and multiculturalism. These are all movements that are reactions against sort of Eurocentric white male, the Eurocentric white male perspective of modernism. Art has definitely become more concerned with social issues and with addressing the concerns of a multicultural world that keeps, due to technology, keeps getting smaller and smaller, artists recognize that and see that to understand the world, we have to live in it. The book goes on to say that postmodernism, usually looks for visual references to past artworks, ideas, or issues, and that identity is an incredibly important theme in postmodernism because we have artists from all backgrounds, and so their personal identity becomes very much a huge part of their work. This is Revolutionary by Wadsworth Jarrell from 1972. This sort of vibrant use of color and texture, to create this unbelievable psychedelic experience, right? Jarrell used art to promote Black pride and Black power. The screen print is a call to activism. And the image is of the great singer Angela Davis. And the words that are used within the piece is love, resist, Black, and nation. And so the work itself subliminally, as you look, even if you're not consciously reading it, those words begin to sort of pop. And so much information Wadsworth Jarrell is giving us, within this amazing image. This is a fantastic work by Zenobia Bailey called Repossessed. Bailey's work is made up of crocheted hats, costumes, wall hangings, and museum installations. It is very much inspired by African, Hindu, and Chinese elements. And it references the absence of historical information about enslaved Africans in America. This is a work by Shireen Nishat called Rapture. The work itself explores the identity of a woman both in and outside of Iran. It uses art to process her feelings of displacement, exile, and loss. Both films, one showing the woman inside Iran and the other showing a woman outside of Iran, are projected at the same time in the same room on opposite walls. And it shows men and women in very separate realms. And we're going to end this chapter talking about installation. Installation originally referred to the hanging of pictures and the arrangement of objects in an exhibition, but it may also refer to an intentional environment created as a completed artwork. A common mode for creating art in the contemporary period is installation. This is a beautiful work by Tara Donovan called Untitled from 2003, and it's completely made out of styrofoam cups that have been hot glued together to create this really sort of amazing ceiling work. So all of those little objects are actually styrofoam cups that she's hot glued, and they sort of melt together. It was installed at Ace Gallery in Los Angeles in 2005. You can see how Donovan's work has this sort of minimalist aesthetic. The experience of the work changes depending on where you're standing in the room. The shape, again, is formed out of those styrofoam cups, and it is very site responsive. Donovan selects materials for the way in which they will interact with the space. If you have any questions, please reach out to me at cakers@lee.edu. Thank you.